When we talk about Europe, for example, this is 400 years of democracy that they have enjoyed since the Renaissance. In the United States, that's taken more than 2 centuries to be where you are. But what we see in the United States now, especially in the global media, is a kind of Trumpism that is really rolling back some of the democratic gains that great country had for a long period of time. And therefore, within Africa too, I think it's going to take some time. But now, because of digital technologies and communication efficiency, that time will be compressed in time. And that time, I hope, will come within our lifetime.
That is encouraging in that, okay, we are going to get there. Anyway, I always like this positive approach to the situation, because otherwise we are going to be hopeless and it's going to be disastrous as it were. All right, now let's look at the African Union. When you look at the European Union, for example, here in Europe, they are responsible for most of the changes that is taking place across the continent. No, of course, not the whole of the continent, but among the Schengen members. In that they are very active in the economy. Of course, it's a political body, so it's natural that they are very active in the politics. So they are very active in terms of providing incentive for infrastructural development to basically make life worthy of living for the Europeans. Now, the African Union is also another body like the European Union, if we must put it like that. For us to be able to get to where we are going, to have accountable leaders, to be able to empower the youth, to be able to have a continent where people can be proud of their lives, can live meaningful life. What role, if any, is the African Union having to play?
The African Union has the African Union Commission as a central organ of the African Union. But we have several other organizations that make up what we call the African Union. But the African Union Commission that we call the AUC is a central organ. But the problem with the African Union Commission being a central organ and setting up the agenda for the meetings of, there are 2 meetings taking place between African heads of state and governments every year. It's an important organization. I think initially what I see in the African Union is a kind of ideological muddle. It doesn't have the kind of ideological trajectory to transform Pan-Africanism from a concept into reality. And I haven't seen that. I mean, I have followed up the African Union for almost 40 years. I have even served within one of its organs. But there is no ideological mechanism within which you can push this forward. The lack of that intellectual capacity in terms of getting to even coax the African leaders into doing something better instead of declarations that come out twice a year. And of course, none of these declarations are implemented properly. And that's one problem. The second problem is there is an incoherence in the core mission of the African Union Commission. The African Union Commission is the kind of secretariat that prepares the next meetings. I don't think it has more leverage in terms of its work with the African countries, with the regional economic communities, and of course, at the end of the day, with the African people. The third area is the lack of corporate capacity within the African Union. You know, the African Union Commission is the contribution of all member states. Of course, these are highly qualified people who can do a lot of miracles, but the problem is they have not been given that opportunity to do so. Because whenever you tread on some paths of intellectual leadership for the African Union Commission, then some head of states might even veto it. The other problem is the African Union Commission is really petrified to build institutions that can function. Of course, we have these hundreds of declarations that come out of the meetings of the leaders of Africa, but the problem is, in terms of implementing these declarations, it's become very difficult for the African Union Commission to transform this into realities, into an action plan, and of course to implement them. There are wonderful words in these declarations which anyone can admire, but the problem is they don't really address the problems that we have in the continent right now. And when you see African leaders now even abusing their own people, they can't even invoke the responsibility to protect a United Nations global declaration where any government that is abusing its own people has to be subjected to neighboring countries' pressure to create a peaceful environment. And of course, there are precautions where the Security Council have to give the green light to do this. But what I see is there is also a glut of intergovernmental bodies. One of the biggest problems we have in Africa is the African Union has all departments that the United Nations has. The African Union has all the departments that the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa has. And of course, there are specialized agencies of the United Nations that should be looking, for example, into food security. The African Union Commission has to focus both on the political aspects and on the peace and security aspects of the continent. It has to leave much of the other human development work to other agencies besides monitoring what's really happening on the ground by these agencies, trying to coordinate the activities of the different agencies, the UN agencies, the World Bank, the IMF, the non-governmental organizations, bilateral aid that comes into the continent. And therefore, we don't have that kind of synergy that the African Union Commission was supposed to bring in. The other problem with the African Union Commission is the choice of the leadership itself. Every time we need the chairperson of the African Union, you see the kind of elections lobbying that's going on across the continent. But frankly, most of these people have become elevated to a position where they cannot do anything. And therefore, Africa needs new institutions that are going to connect countries. For example, I see some kind of progress within the East African bloc, where Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, to some degree, Ethiopia, Djibouti, are trying to create the infrastructure to connect the countries and also to allow free movements of people, although the African Union has this declaration from a long time back. So the African Union has to be reformed. The African Union Commission has to be reformed really vehemently if we're going to have to move to the next step. And for this, we need the member states leaders to be able to push that into that kind of reform, besides just coming for meetings which last 1 day or 2 days and go back to their homes. And in some cases, some leaders are not, they haven't even attended the African Union meetings for a long period of time. So you can see how relevant that commission is in terms of getting these leaders to kind of meetings. Most of the leaders, for example, they would go if the United States US-Africa summit is there, or a France-Africa summit is there. And the second thing is here, their contribution becomes more meaningful in terms of what they want from each other. But when the African Union summit takes place, in most cases, speech after speech and endorsement of declarations that have been created by the African Union Commission, endorsed by the PRC, and eventually, of course, endorsed by the foreign ministers of each country. So the modalities of work of the African Union Commission has to change completely. We need also to change the people who work there. I don't think African Union work or the United Nations work should be a lifetime work. These are supposed to transform nations. We see, for example, the Western private sector really transforming their countries. People are going to a digital age, but here we're still talking about issues that are not even on the ground, that are not even in the contributing to the development of human beings in Africa. And therefore, we need visionary leaders who can really transform Africa. And the African Union Commission is a central organ to do this.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Costantinos. Now, Looking at the African Union again, because I have two more questions to ask about that, because it's very important as far as the leadership in Africa is concerned. Is it like, is African Union like many other governments we have in Africa, which are often like a kind of a shadow government, as it were, because they are not really representing their people. They are like a kind of employee for other agencies outside Africa, just there to manage the local resources for their interests. Should we consider the African Union like that, or do they really have the intention of effecting a change in Africa? By effecting a change, of course, I mean, we need to develop infrastructure. We need to have a plan. We need to be able to have a road that connects South Africa from Cape Town to Cairo, as it were, you know? What is happening in Africa? We are basically having an emergency. We are running a system of emergency, like I usually describe the Nigeria system, no? People are about to die. Let's just quickly go there and give them some money so that they can be alive. We are tired of being alive. We want to run our system. And for us to run our system, we need to be capable. We need to know what we want. And this plan needs to be really realistic. So like I was saying just now, for example, the European Union, they don't just go there to talk. Okay, they can also be talking, but we can see the evidence of what they are doing. Of course, in the African Union chapter, there are a lot of beautiful ideas and all that. I'm not talking about the idea. I mean, the reality. Can we make it possible so that the African youth no longer die on the sea to cross to Europe? Does that concern the African Union or the African leaders? Because if it doesn't concern them, who should it concern? So what are the plans for the African Union to develop African market? What are their plans to develop the road?
You see, I mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Area earlier, and we have all the hype that surrounds this free trade area. But how is that free trade going to happen unless we have the infrastructure to do it, unless we have the peace and security along borders of countries to have it? If we take the Horn of Africa, for example, Somalia has been called a failed state for more than 2 decades. South Sudan, we have a live conflict going on. Sudan has conflicts in 4 areas, Kordofan, Abyei, Blue Nile, and Darfur. Ethiopia has its own internal conflicts. Ethiopia and Eritrea have been fighting for decades. And when you look at this, and to complicate this, the Gulf is also on fire with the Gulf War on Yemen. And therefore, how is trade cooperation going to happen when you have all these problems at hand? As I said earlier, for example, if you take the DRC, it has lots of resources. At one time, I was heading a team to develop the infrastructure within the Great Lakes of Africa. And this required billions and billions of dollars. But the problem is we cannot even stop the looting of the DRC resources: gold, copper, diamonds, flora and fauna. And the reason why we have the conflicts going on and pandemics attacking the people of the DRC is because there are so many interests in this which are financing the conflict from outside. And I don't think the African Union Commission has a mandate to do anything on this, except, of course, to come up with beautiful declarations that are worth really listening to. The problem is African leaders have to take concrete steps. Some countries in Africa have tried to contribute now, for example, to peacekeeping operations. Ethiopia has the largest peacekeeping operations in Africa today. And it has done that in Burundi, it has done that in Sudan, it has done that in South Sudan and Somalia. But these peacekeeping operations also express the motives of the nations that are sending the peacekeepers, although they are under the hat of the United Nations and the African Union. So,
hey, I hope you're having a good value from this podcast. Now, in case you want to improve yourself, we do have an e-learning community where you can learn anything from learning how to use computer, build a website, or set up a home business for yourself. All these and many more are available by becoming a member of our e-learning community. And it costs you as little as 65 cents per day. Of course, this is something anybody can afford. How do you get started? It's simple. Just go to Google and type aclasses.org or write me the personal email at obehi@aclasses.org and we will set you up for your self-improvement journey faster than you can imagine. I repeat, aclasses.org or obehi@aclasses.org. Now, let's return to the podcast.
In order to undertake this, the African Union Commission must have a very strong arm to be able to do these things. Sometimes the African Union Commission has a problem even paying salaries. The contribution from member states is not forthcoming. And the large majority of this funding comes from North American and European sources. And how is the African Union Commission to have an independent view and independent policy that benefits Africa when it is hooked to the umbilical cord of donor money? And therefore, it's very difficult to see this. And it also shows you in how much genuine the African leaders are in trying to support a continental organization to do its job properly. Most African countries can really pay for the entire budget of the African Union Commission. Gaddafi was doing that in Libya, but when NATO was bombing Libya, the African Union was completely quiet. And today, Libya has been transformed from a country of human well-being, the best healthcare services in the continent, the best livelihood security that people had, even by standards of Europe. But just to kill one person, NATO bombed that country, and you have now a phantom state which is run by 100 guerrilla groups. And today the issue has become the survival of the Libyan people, where food aid is being delivered to them when they have a great nation with great resources. And therefore, you can also see the way the UN recognized government in Libya and the rogue general, who is an alternative government on the other side, being supported by different international organizations and supported by different countries to promote the issue of conflicts in Libya, because the peace in Libya might not be to the interest of those who are benefiting from it. But where is the African Union Commission in this? Frankly, this is the basket case that can test the African Union Commission's efficiency in terms of showing to the whole world what is really happening in Libya. And of course, the United Nations has a special representative to undertake the peace issues and negotiations in Libya. But where is the African Union, frankly? And much of the problems that we see in Africa are not handled by the African Union, but they are handled by interested Western countries, which then assign special representatives either from the UN or from the EU or from the US. And therefore, the African Union Commission must have that kind of leadership which says, no, this is Africa, and we have to deal with it as Africans. Otherwise, what is the point of being a chairperson or a vice chairperson or a commissioner of the African Union? These people are intelligent enough to find jobs elsewhere. Frankly, they don't need this job for survival. But you need some kind of a commitment. It's people who are in top positions who can really transform this kind of institutions. But the institution building part has been put aside because these people are only interested in maintaining the status quo. And therefore, maintaining status quo doesn't take you anywhere. Change is very abrasive, but it's going to be the motive energy for transforming institutions into what they should be. This is the same problem with the United Nations today. The United Nations is being bankrupt. I saw the Secretary General writing a memo saying he had only 2 months' salary for his staff a while ago. And therefore, it's very important, that these global governance and regional governance institutions be led by people who have vision and who want to transform it. More than that, the civil society movement in Africa has also been modeled under these conditions. And therefore, we need civil society leaders who have their own independent incomes, who can advocate for the betterment of the African people, and for the creation of better organizations at the continent level. And of course, we shouldn't lump Africa together because simply we are a continent that belong to one geographic divide. Africa is a continent with 2,000 ethnic groups and language, different cultures. And therefore, you need to have some kind of background, intellectual information on how the kind of integration is going to happen. We cannot simply talk about African integration in 2063. It's simply impossible. If we don't lay the foundations, we've seen the problems that the European Union is having today between the UK and the EU. But the point is, in Africa, it could be much easier because we have a lot of areas of commonality. Poverty is number one, climate change is number two, democratization is number three, livelihood security of our people is number four, the development of educational institutions is number five, and you can go on. We have so much commonalities that we need to develop. The human security agenda in other parts of the world is not so urgent, but in Africa it is.
Thank you so much. Anyway, I think the interest, the survival of the African people should have been number one. But anyway, it's okay, it's fine, because we don't have quality leaders, so the interest of the people is not actually, it's not important. Because like you were saying, for example, when the West decided that they want to remove Gaddafi because it wasn't serving their interest, the African leaders were nowhere to be found because, like we have been saying, they look like they are representing other people other than the African people. And this makes it very difficult. Because look at, for example, look at the African Union. If you are not the one financing it, if you are not the one funding it, how can you possibly be in charge? Because there is a saying in my place, I think maybe it's in your place too, that he who plays the piper detains his tone. I am paying your bill, I should decide how it is run. If the African leaders, if as rich as the government is, the individual government is, looking at Nigeria, looking at South Africa, Egypt, or Congo, okay, that have been mismanaged. If these countries have managed their resources, they don't need the United Nations, they don't need the European Union or maybe some big NGO from America to come and pay for the services of the African Union. Because if those people are the one paying for the salaries, for the building, for the project that these guys are bringing out in Addis Ababa, we will be deceiving ourselves to think that they will really think of the interests of the African people. Because what the African Union are doing to the African people, the European Union, if they do it, it will be closed. Because they are just there like kind of ceremonials, as it were, so that we will also, okay, like every other part of the world, we also have a body, we also have a group. But it's really ineffective. And they haven't been able to define why they are there. Because if you are a leader and you cannot prove to the lead, to the follower, why you are a leader, why you are leading there, you are ineffective. The people don't need you, actually. That is what most of the leaders we have, that is what they demonstrate. Anyway, now, I'm going to ask you the question like this. How do you, looking at maybe, for example, the example from the African Union, like you have just explained, and many other leaders in Africa, which of course you know very well because you are influential in this area, you are well informed in this area. How do you describe the current crop of leaders in Africa? Because leaders, I think, should be defined based on their responsibility to the local people, not just the office. Because if you are not responsible to the local people, then I don't know what you should be doing there. So how do you look at the African leader, the current that we have today?
Some African leaders decide to stay for a long period of time, like President Mugabe, who ruled that country for nearly 40 years. Bashir in Sudan has been there for 3 decades. Uganda. We can mention many countries. In some cases, we have leadership like Rwanda, for example, President Kagame, who really spearheaded the termination of the genocide in Rwanda. And therefore, I know many human rights groups have issues to raise with President Kagame, but he's been a great leader for that country. More or less, Rwanda has become the center of Africa in terms of the kind of international connections are being undertaken, the kind of digital transformation you see in that country. And in a country where 1 million people were slaughtered with axe and machetes, today Rwanda is a different country. But elsewhere, you look at even the post-Arab Spring countries, which are really deteriorating in terms of their human rights and democratization credentials. In others, you see, the problem has been we have greedy leaders in Africa. They steal from their own pockets and they go and put the money elsewhere. President Mobutu of DRC, nobody knows where his money is. Over $6 billion has sunk into some kind of a black hole. And therefore, their interest is to loot money, to have control, and to kill anybody who comes on their way to contest their presidency or their empires. And therefore, frankly, we don't have this kind of great leaders coming up. And this is a problem with the adoption of the political party system in which the Western model of political party formation hasn't really worked in this continent. And therefore, it's important that we look, our intellectuals, our academics should look into alternative ways of working into the democratization of this continent. We have examples of traditional democratic communities in Africa. Everywhere in Africa, if you go, you find rural communities that are administering themselves outside the states. In fact, most of the states have no control outside the capital city. And therefore, you mentioned Nigeria earlier. I mean, almost 70% of the population is urban. But the problem is with that kind of intellectual capacity, with that kind of economy, Nigeria couldn't bring out the young leadership that can use their intellectual capacity and their political articulation to the promotion of the Nigerian people. Of course, I've seen a lot of progress in Nigeria, but we can do more. I think Nigeria could have been an example for the African continent. South Africa is another case, which could have been another example for the continent. But what we see is a deterioration in times and improvement in other times. But the kind of leadership we have in Africa is once they are in power, they want to maintain in power by changing the constitutions, by changing the modalities of governance, by making sure that they are indispensable to maintain law and order, peace and security in that country. They haven't opened up the political space to a point where all good-willing Africans could participate in the development of this great continent. So this is problematic. The number of presidents we have that are very old is obvious. I can mention their names, but that doesn't make any sense. And the problem is also the longevity they have in office, 2 decades, 3 decades with one person and one family. And that becomes also the kind of corruption that we have in this continent. This continent is being looted left and right. The official statistics for the organizations like International Global Financial Integrity, Transparency International, these are only official arenas that we hear. But there are also areas where they don't have any access in terms of information. It's only predictions that can come from these institutions. But if you have a vibrant civil society and a responsible media, especially investigative media, that can show to the African people what the leaders are doing, movements can rise up against these people to a point where their accountability will be improved. But today, they're not accountable to anybody. Whenever they go in their own cities and towns, they're protected by huge military parades. Sometimes, most African leaders, they are only visible to their own population on TV screens. You don't even have the opportunity to see them live because they are afraid for their life.